joining us again. Community conversations was something that was come up with by the Full Circle team so that we could bring together educators in a good way across Turtle Island. We've had some incredible speakers, really strong advocates in their community. And today we are joined by none other than Albert McLeod. So Albert, thank you for joining us today. Albert and just taught me how to say his ancestral land's name, so I'm going to try this again for everybody. Is from Nisichawayasihk Cree Nation and the Metis communities of Cross Lake here in Manitoba, and he has been a foundational person in the Two-Spirit and education movement in Manitoba in many different ways and lights. And we are just so thankful that you're here to share your education and story with us here on what you're doing today.
Thank you. You want me to start?
Yeah.
Yeah, so welcome everyone to this session about Two-Spirit, individuals in institutions, educational institutions, which could be, from kindergarten to grade 12 and into universities and other institutions, research areas. So this is going to be a PowerPoint because I think visual examples are very helpful for people to conceptualize some of what I will be sharing. And knowledge is not static. There's always, new knowledge coming in many forms. And, I just was, I think 30 years ago, a father took his two sons who were adolescents on a 12,000-mile canoe trip from Winnipeg to the Gulf of Mexico and Bolivia. So I was thinking about that. They went down the Mississippi, and I have a colleague, Dr. Alex Wilson, for the University College of the North, and we converse about history and Indigenous history and experiences. And I said to her, it could be that Indigenous people made that journey as well, by canoe, maybe 5,000 years ago, and met the people in South America. And so a lot of history cannot be known truly, but those are examples of what, historically is possible, and that Indigenous people can rely on that thousands of years of history and possibilities of how people connected to the ecosystems or the land, or even to each other in different nations in the continents. So again, those possibilities always present themselves, and they can be random, coming out of different places, and it all combines with institutional education in terms of creating a complete picture or a larger picture of what we understand as history and experiences. So I'm going to go to my slides here, see if I can find them. It's always sneaky. So again, this is a presentation around Indigenous and Two-Spirit perspectives with education. Education systems, historically and contemporary wise as well. And my perspective is around the work that's been done to assist Two-Spirit people in educational institutions to graduate with diplomas and degrees. And we'll look at that process throughout the slides. But this is a photo from today from the University of Winnipeg Pride event this morning. So this photo is fresh off the bridge here. And it shows the Metis flag, the progressive pride flag, but it also shows the Two-Spirit flag. So when we think about decolonization and reconciliation, the truth and reconciliation process and calls for action, universities and institutions have all, attempted in various ways to participate in reconciliation. So this was a very, wonderful visual event. The president was there and we had elders speaking. And again, it is about visual cues about what is safe, what is representative in terms of institutions, because it is at the the building there, which looks like an old colonial castle, which for some people can be very challenging because it is very colonial looking. But again, the sidewalk is painted with the transgender colors as well as the Two-Spirit flag color. So that's been, again, an example of how making spaces accessible and safe for Indigenous people, and in this case, Two-Spirit people. Another example is Red River College, who again is a large institution, has many campuses, not just in Winnipeg, but satellite campuses. And the last few years, they've done a similar process of creating a sidewalk visual that includes the pride colors of the progressive flag, but also Indigenous identity there in the center there with the Four Directions colors. So this was outside the institution there in the Notre Dame campus. But unfortunately on May 5th, both of these signs were damaged and vandalized, actually. So that wasn't, for myself, a good sign. That, whether it was random, I don't suspect it was random. I think it was intentional homophobic or transphobic reaction. Because those sidewalks they're very large. You cannot avoid them if you want to get in the building. So in some cases, people may feel threatened by that experience of having that sort of representation of two LGBTQIA people so out there in an educational institution. So those again are examples. And we know throughout Manitoba during Pride, the Pride walkways that are painted are in, many different communities, on reserve, off reserve, northern and remote. But in some cases, people will, drive over them, in some ways try to make a statement, about damaging them. So when we go back to, the place of Indigenous people in contemporary Canadian society and the institutions and systems that provide education, and again, this is what we put together in the last 500 years is what we call the sciences, or knowledge or education. But certainly in a colonial context, that only goes back 500 years. And we've drawn from all over the world, for, mathematics, health, all of those knowledges. But in many ways, as I said earlier, Indigenous knowledge extends back tens of thousands of years. Now we're just coming to a period of opening those doors to that knowledge and beginning to examine it, apply it if we can, and honor it, in the sciences that we have today. So this slide is called "We Always Educate, We Will Always Educate, and We Will Always Need Education." So again, knowledge is not static. And in terms of, this session is going to focus more on older adolescents, which could be junior high, high school, or university level. And I've included the senior years as well, because that is also the inclusion of Two-Spirit knowledge keepers or elders in institutions. And that is, I think, in many cases unique to the Indigenous community, that in our educations, I don't see it so much in the mainstream or the newcomer community, that they have attempted to include elders or knowledge keepers in their education systems. So this is Barbara Bruce, who's a Metis Two-Spirit elder from St. Laurent, Manitoba. She has an Order of Manitoba received recently. And this is Mani Chakabi, who's a lesbian grandmother from Thunder Bay. And she published a book about her life experiences. So again, when we talk about that sort of age of, education, and then the middle and senior years, that they're still very much invested and involved in their communities as what we call knowledge keepers. So when we think about potentially how many Two-Spirit people there could be in Canada, the recent census says there's 1.8 million Indigenous people. So an estimate, per population could be up to 10% of any population could be Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA. So that's about 180,000 people in Canada. So it's not a small number. And again, many of them, from my experience, will be attracted to education, like graduating high school, entering university, and having a formal career. And so to me, this estimate of 10% could be higher because there's no real research in Canada or the US that shows what proportion of the Indigenous populations actually would identify as 2S LGBTQI. I like to say it could be as high as 30%. You know, we don't know because, again, we haven't asked those questions or done any of that research. And in terms of the history of education in Canada, and there was a recent conversation about this appointment that the Premier made of someone who is considered a residential school denier, who goes from the side, well, residential schools benefited Indigenous people, right, as opposed to seeing the historic trauma and violations that occurred over that 150-year period. And so we're still historically impacted by Indian residential schools and day schools in Canada. And you see the breadth of them right across into the high Arctic that they had these schools, which were very much invested in extracting the children from their parents, from their communities, and their elders. And you'll see there in the prairies, that line, that is actually the line of the boreal forest, right? Where the plains were actually, was for farming, right? So there was, the schools were just at the edge of the boreal forest there on that line, right? To keep them as far away from their parents as possible. So the state-sponsored churches that ran Indian residential schools and day schools was the Anglican Church, the Baptist Church, the Mennonite Pioneer Mission, Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the United Church of Canada. And really it was, you know, complicity with the state in terms of that strategy to remove these children and the funding that would flow from the federal government or provincial governments to, you know, build these institutions and hire teachers and all of that kind of thing. Now, this school was called Guy Indian Residential School, and this is up in northern Manitoba, about an hour and a half north of the Pas. It was opened in 1926 and it burnt down accidentally in 1952. So again, it was a very isolated part of Manitoba, Saskatchewan. Even today, it's sort of it's difficult to get to. It's an hour and a half through, you know, a country road through the bush to get to the small First Nation in Sturgeon Landing. But again, this was the school, and you see two priests there at the time. It was an accident with the boiler, I think, in the furnace, and it burned down during the summertime when the students were away from school. But Dr. Maria Yellis Braveheart has done some work about defining what that historic trauma encompasses. And so some of her work was around identifying historical trauma response features, some of what we might recognize, especially for students who are coming institutions and having to deal with, you know, classes and schedules and, you know, time and all those kind of things, without resolving that historic trauma experience, which complicates their ability to concentrate on their studies and, you know, be successful in the education. So survival get depression, sometimes PTSD symptoms, psychic numbing, fixation to trauma, somatic or physical symptoms, low self-esteem, victim identity, anger, self-destructive behavior, including substance abuse, suicidal ideation, hypervigilance, intense fear, disassociation, compensatory fantasies, and poor affect or emotional tolerance. And so again, these are in many cases subconscious, and in a community or family, they become social norms where there's no objectivity to see that there's anything different in terms of emotional or mental or psychological responses, because it's across the board sometimes in families or in communities. And without resolving this, it becomes, again, a barrier or a challenge to concentration, right? In terms of Two-Spirit people, some of that trauma gets projected onto Two-Spirit people because, again, we're vulnerable. We don't have any social recognition status. We're kind of seen as corrupt spirits or abominations, you know, we're sort of not meant to be. So what happens is that the previous trauma gets projected onto us, but other specific trauma related to homophobia and transphobia can be the killing of family-centered love and nurturing, homophobia and transphobia, exclusion, rejection, and shunning, incest and sexual assault, humiliation, shaming, and bullying, isolation and depression, murder or being disappeared, suicidal ideation and suicide, homelessness and poverty, the devaluing of the queer agenda, devaluing queer gender, and sexual identity. And, you know, growing up, I knew many of my friends would say, you know, if someone was, you know, had homosexual behavior, their parents were waiting for them to come out of that phase and eventually become heterosexual, right? And they would wait, you know, and say, well, you know, oh, you know, you'll get over it and then you'll get married and give us grandchildren, right? So again, that's that devaluing of your queer experience and identity. And then intimidation and threats. Additional ones can be lateral violence, and these again can be common as a result of historic trauma, gaslighting, ghosting, microaggressions, cyberbullying, incest, sexual exploitation, or domestic violence. Now, working around what would be Indigenous ways of being, and that was specific to pre-colonial cultures and child rearing and social norms. And Dr. Claire Brandt, who was working at the Health Science Center, made an observation of some of the children that were being you know, sent to psych health at the HSC, and he realized that some of the non-Indigenous psychologists were misinterpreting what these children were experiencing. And he was able to flesh out these unique Indigenous child rearing ethics and rules of behavior, such as conflict suppression, non-interference, non-competitiveness, emotional restraint, sharing of knowledge or wealth, the concept of time, social norms and protocols, and this idea of the superego and how the superego was diminished in terms of adolescent age, development. So the example of the superego is when children were sort of doted on and spoiled to give them a sense of confidence, resilience in their own worldview. And so up to the age of 7, they were the center of attention. And because they had to, go into their next peer group, that superego was diminished by teasing and that kind of thing, so they could relate and make relationships with their peers in their next peer group, right? So Dr. Brandt, identified these in 1990, and sadly he died around that time as well, and was not able to continue his work. But this is actually included in the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry from Manitoba final report as a guide, for correctional institutions to think about the people they're dealing with, and they've grown up with a unique community experience of child rearing, but also community relationships and concepts, right? And again, these may not flourish well in a competitive system like high school or university, right? Which again is you're expected to always have high grades, be studying and conversing with other students and learning from each other. But if you've been raised with these social norms that don't necessarily fit with the Western way of education, right? Now, this young person here from a few years ago, biological male, but was raised with these ethics by their parents, in that he identified as a female. And here he is in a jingle dress, and he wins the jingle dress competition, right? So again, it's how the family follows the child's path and respects it as not disrupting it, right, in terms of the child's development. Also worked with Roger Ouellette, who's an Ojibwe language specialist, on authenticating Indigenous and Ojibwe values and beliefs. And so he developed a concept based on the Indigenous language and life philosophies. And the one that was most important was about land-based survival, particularly the winter. And you know, in Winnipeg, we have 6 months of winter. We have 4 seasons: winter, 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 and summer. But he said in that relationship with the natural world, this ethic or belief or value came out, which is called Vapiwin, which means survival and overcoming. And how that was achieved was by facing our fears, real or imagined, the observant study of events, which we could equate to research, and then deduction, again, which is strategic planning, right? So all of these fit into that education dynamic. But he said that another important facet was the honoring and giving thanks, right? So that's what we do at graduation. It's a big celebration. We honor the students, we honor the educators, and we have a feast, right? Literally, we have a feast, right? And we bring in the elders, right? So it's this whole thing, we honor and give thanks. But this honoring and giving thanks was also related to the spiritual world and natural world. And I don't think we necessarily do that at convocations, but I know that we do powwows now in a lot of the education institutions. So that is a similar way of doing that, honoring and thanking ancestors and the natural world by the ceremony and the dancing. And this is Roger's, again, Anishinaabe life model. And it took him about 50 years to develop this after talking to Ojibwe elders and knowledge keepers who actually had grown up in the late 1800s and had only lived in the Ojibwe world, right? And had very little knowledge or experience of the Western world, right? So he created this wheel, and I asked him, you know, the Indigenous medicine wheel is broken up into 4 areas: the child, the youth, and the elder. And I said, in your model, does it fit with the medicine wheel age groups? And he said it did, right? He didn't argue with me on that. He agreed it could, right? So that was good. And so again, it becomes a useful tool in understanding that philosophy that Indigenous people had about social relationships, but also surviving the natural environment. And again, knowledge transfer Indigenous people is very complex and sophisticated. In the Western way, it's kind of based on, this is the science, this is the knowledge as we know it, as we put together in 500 years, and this is the facts, right? But in terms of Indigenous knowledge transfer, it's more sophisticated and it's not always literal, right? And that's to give the other person or body time to be objective or to even remove themselves from the conversation, because it's not a time to engage, right? And in Western society, we don't have that, right? It's always immediate, very close quarters, shaking of hand, jumping into a conversation and introducing our titles, right? So there's no opportunity to not engage in that. It would be seen as you know, disrespectful to do that. But in the culture, it was more sophisticated and complex in these relationships with other humans. So it's based on metaphors, analogies, and euphemisms and allegories, right? And also it's the use of our 7 senses, and I've included the general ones we're aware of: seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, but also intuition and premonition, which was, you know, Indigenous people meditated, they were highly achieved cognitively, you know, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, so that intuition and perception and premonition were very highly attuned skills that, early settlers did not recognize, and they called it witchcraft or conjuring, right? Not realizing it had evolved over tens of thousands of years. Now, this slide is again the Ojibwe creation story, and it's about the creation of Turtle Island after the old world had been lost in a flood. And again, it's based on these metaphors and analogies and euphemisms. And in the end of the story, the muskrat is the small animal that's able to achieve the goal of finding the old earth and bringing up some old soil so that Nanabozho can build Turtle Island, right? But it's a fable because it's also originally a story for children, and it has all these characters and animals and adventures, but it's also for adults. And I'll give you a spoiler. What is implied when the muskrat goes into the dark, cold water to find the old earth is a metaphor for humans, that sometimes when we're seeking knowledge or we're facing challenges, that we go inward, right? We dive into the, our mind, our psyche, our spirit to find the solution. So that's the moral for the adult in this particular legend. Another teaching from Roger is the concept of MMIWG, which means given or received from the divine. So this tells us that prior to contact, Indigenous people had a capacity and ability to petition the spiritual world, the natural world, for things that were needed to be human, right? And again, through a lot of the ceremonies, which were for 80 years in Canada, were actually illegal to practice for Indigenous people. That dormancy caused a lot of chaos, right? And now with our students in schools, it's a time to tell them, you have that gift, you have the capacity, you have the innate, the inherent ability to petition the natural world, the spiritual world for what you need, right? And it's embedded in the language, this capacity, right? And we don't tell our students that, right? It is, as an Indigenous person, this is what your ancestors practiced, for thousands of years. And from my own experience, it works. And again, with the Indian residential schools, we had the apology. And I believe that was the influence of MMIWG, because 10 years ago, if you thought that the Pope of the Vatican would come to Canada and apologize, everybody would have said, impossible, you're daydreaming. But it happened, right? So again, it is that wealth, strength, and capacity of Indigenous knowledge to work in the 21st century and to resolve historic harms, particularly around education. Now, in terms of Two-Spirit people, it is that historically that experience was prohibited, it was censored, and it was driven erased, right, in Canada and in the US, because again, it was a challenge to the binary construction that was a driver for colonialism. So when we think about equity and access, it is about, as Two-Spirit people, who and what do we desire? Who and what are we attracted to? Who and how do we seek pleasure, intimacy? Are we lusty like our siblings that procreate? And do we seek love? What does love mean to us, right? So it is that conversation that the Pope didn't have in the Vatican when the Indigenous people went to converse with him there. And it never occurred in Canada either. The absence of the harms of Indian residential school and the exclusion of Two-Spirit people in those institutions, those educational institutions, is still not resolved to this day, because it's been, again, hidden by, the Confederation of Catholic Bishops, the Indigenous groups that negotiated this apology, and the government of Canada, right? They're all still involved in this, idealizing of the binary to appease the Catholic Church, even in an apology. So anyway, these are two Indigenous dancers from the Nevada area, and they're not shy about expressing their attraction to each other, an intimacy, a kiss between two men, rarely seen in Indigenous communities, right? This expression of love and nurturing and intimacy, right? We see a lot of men and women doing that because that's the binary social norm, but rarely, and in some cases, this can bring about violence, right? If this is a public demonstration. So in terms of the Indigenous research lands, the macro is the eagle, the big picture, and we're the Miso people, we're the local organizations, we do all the building. And then the micro is more the deeper knowledge analysis. And in this way we have a crow or a raven, because they're very intelligent, but they're also get that close-up view of what's happening on the ground. And in terms of the Pride movement, which again began in the 60s as, resistance to the policing of sex, to the policing of gender by the state, and how the police were used as a tool to impose the binary and the colonial binary. So this is the original Pride flag from 1978 that has 8 colors. And the bottom one, violet, represents spirit, and the top one, hot pink, represents sex. Now, beyond that, they began to use only 6 colors because I think it was cheaper to print 6 colors than 8. And this is kind of the contemporary iterations of the Pride flag. And the progress flag here includes, people of color, Indigenous and Black people, as well as transgender people. So in the Pride movement itself has evolved, right? And these are 2 examples of 2-spirit Pride flags with the 2 eagle feathers and the medicine wheel. Now, in terms of institutions, whether it's law, health, education, it's still formulated on a patriarchal worldview, a colonial one, right? That empowers, Euro-Christian males and their descendants, right? Even Prime Minister, like he's a Catholic, French Catholic, right? So you see the influence even today of how pervasive that patriarchy is in all of our systems, and how it was propaganda in those 300 to 400 years, the idealization of patriarchy through media, through art, and through our institutions. Up to every year we get Santa Claus, right? It has become such a part of North American culture, but we also realize he's a religious icon who gives away gifts for free once a year, right? In a capitalist society. So I call him the car salesman of colonialism. But the point of these images is that the white beard is the emoji meant to influence us subconsciously. Where's the center of authority, power, and knowledge, right? And if you go to our universities, go look at the early deans, right? And they'll all have white beards. And it tells you the source of the knowledge, the systems, the buildings we work in are all based on this patriarchal history. But what if God was a woman, right? And again, it's that discourse about the privilege of gender, the negotiation between, the binary genders, the idealized male or the idealized female in a colonial context, and the removal of pragmatism and common sense and reason in, the gender politics, right? And this is Ashley Collingville from Alberta. And you can see the comparison and the influence of colonialism She's wearing the crown. She was Mrs. Universe in 2015. The mask of beauty, right? And being sexualized in order to achieve that crown, right? So you see the difference between the historic Cree women and the contemporary Cree women who has to fit into that colonial idea of beauty, right? To receive that recognition. And then Harmonia Rosales, and from 2017, has taken that Sistine Chapel image of, that the supreme being for colonialism was a white European god, and replaced it with an African American female, and replaced, Adam with an African American Eve, right? And when this painting was launched in 2017, she actually received death threats, right? Because she was disrupting that narrative, these sort of sanctified images of our past and the upholding of patriarchy through imagery, right? Through art. So the Two-Spirit name, again, is a part of decolonization and reconciliation, as we are now with reclaiming Indigenous names for our communities, and discarding old colonial ones, like that were actually forts or posts for the Hudson's Bay. And so at that time, the name was introduced by Dr. Myra Laramie, who still works with Winnipeg School Division number 1. And a lot of times people say, well, that has to be about gender. And because we're urban, that's our go-to, that, it has to be about human and being gender, right? Because it's about spirituality, right? But in my analysis, 30 years on, that the name came during resistance to colonialism, the year of Oka resistance. And when Elijah Harper killed the Mutual Aid Accord here in our legislature. So my analysis is actually the spirit that is talked about is the name binds Indigenous LGBTQI people to the energy and power of the natural and spiritual worlds of their ancestors. It also binds Indigenous LGBTQI people to the spirit of respect, nurturing, and love in their families and communities and nations, right? So it's more complex than just about, being non-binary or LGBTQ, which is the automatic go-to because our genders are politicized in this nation, right? That it's a bit more complex than that, I believe, anyway. Now, in working with Roger Roulette, he said Ojibwe had a much more complex view of the human being. So the word term awe is an Ojibwe word which literally means the animate being is who the animate being is supposed to be. And because the Algonquin languages such as Cree and Ojibwe, their pronouns have no gender as he or she, right? As they do in English. Instead, they have proximates which are understood to be either he/she, the animate being, or something alive. And that is that objectivity and stepping back, because we're talking about animate beings such as plants, animals, or humans, right? We have a prescription for the natural world, and that there's that depth of respect and that objectivity, and we don't try to corral people into identities that we think they should have, right? And it's interesting, like in the Cree word, the word for child is awasis. And here you have awi, right? which means this being is what they're supposed to be, right? So in terms of the Indigenous cultural imperative around creation of humans, every child has a purpose, a role, a destiny, and possesses a divine gift. This philosophy applies to LGBTQI Two-Spirit people who also come from the spiritual world. To negatively interfere with the life journey of Two-Spirit people is a social and cultural taboo among Indigenous peoples around the world. It's bad form. And so this is, again, a pre-contact understanding of inclusion based on pragmatism, common sense, and reason, is you need everybody to help harvest or, paddle the canoe, whatever. But in a colonial context, what is supreme is the binary gender identity and heteronormativity or heterosexism. And it is that erasure of Indigenous knowledge and ways of being and upholding the ultra-masculine and the ultra-female, which are not productive and could actually lead to gender-based violence. And that's what we see. And that's why we had an inquiry in Canada, because it's a product of colonialism in the idealization of these male and female roles without the balancing of those other roles and knowledge in between. So the reemergence began in 1975, which I think is 48 years ago, almost half a century. So what I'm telling you is not new, not if it's almost half a century old. And Randy Burns was one of those people in San Francisco in 1975, and he's still alive. I just saw him in February in San Francisco. We've been on our own reconciliation journey across the border with our Two-Spirit counterparts in the US. And so we've been doing what reconciliation means, which is visiting each other. It's like Amazing Race Two-Spirit. And we've been doing it for 35 years before the TRC, right? We've sort of evaporated that border. We've gone and spent time with each other in these sacred landscapes, right? Again, they're having their gathering will be their 25th gathering this year. And so this is the community, elders, grandparents, parents, doctors, paramedics, nurses, professors, children, grandchildren. It's not a stereotype, right? These are the contributors to the wealth and health of communities, right? Because very accomplished and intelligent people, right? And this is just a short snapshot when they come together for 4 days out of the year. Okay? The University of Winnipeg had a call to conversation because we felt that TRC did not address Two-Spirit issues and the opportunity to dismantle the binary, because the schools were actually physical binary constructions of male and female. So we added 39 calls to action just to catch up. And it's available online. And we held this in October of 2017. And it wasn't just for Indigenous people, it was also for queer people of color who go through those same experiences. In terms of governance, Treaty Council number 3, next door province, actually has created a Two-Spirit Council, right, in their governance system as an act of decolonization and reconciliation, and that erasure of Two-Spirit people from the governance systems that kept their communities together. And we had an apology from my Prime Minister in 2017, and he included the colonial erasure of Two-Spirit people. For suppressing Two-Spirit Indigenous values and beliefs, we are sorry. And Canada is only one of 3 states who have apologized to their Two-Spirit LGBTQIA citizens. In the inquiry, there were 32 Two-Spirit specific calls for justice. And the acronym, the longest acronym in the world, is championed by Indigenous people of Canada. So we are very proud that our elders can roll this off their tongues like crazy, like 2S LGBTQIA+. And this is Manny in the launch of the report in 2019. And this is an Eagle staff for transgender people behind her. So when we think about reconciliation, here is a lesbian Ojibwe elder carrying the Eagle staff. That's what we're talking about in real time, right? And in authentic experiences of righting the wrongs that happened in the past, right? I was part of the sub-working group, the 2Spirit one that wrote the National Action Plan. If you were wondering what we were doing during COVID, that's what we were doing. We were writing the action plan. Now, in terms of the 32 justice areas, you know, they're quite across the board, but number 20 there is school education. And this is what it says. We call upon provincial and territorial governments and schools to ensure that students are educated about gender and sexual identity, including 2S LGBTQIA identities in schools. And this was the report, the federal one on the left, and then the 2Spirit one here that was launched in 2021. In Manitoba, we have the 2Spirit archives at the University of Winnipeg, and they're actually hosting a video documentary screening on Wednesday afternoon. And that video was shot in Winnipeg in 1990 at the time of Oka and the Meech Lake Accord deliberations and the 2Spirit gathering when the 2Spirit name came. So that documentary includes an Indigenous person from Manitoba, was archived by the National Film Board, and we had to get special permission to unarchive it and present it at the UW on Wednesday afternoon. So in terms of our strategy is to leave a footprint of our 2Spirit identity for the future, and especially in an academic situation here in a library archives at the UW. There's another collection at the University of Minnesota as well. And again, going forward, we created a group in Canada, we call it Enchante Canada, which is over 200 LGBTQ2 organizations in Canada. And we created a national network for 2Spirit people, 2Spirits in Motion Society. And here's our Prime Minister when he first became Prime Minister. Look how free he was, hopefully he was, before he went to Ottawa. Well, anyway. So I'm part of the Team Thunderhead, and our team from Manitoba, we won the international competition to create the National Monument to LGBTQIA Monument in Ottawa. And it has a 2Spirit healing circle here as part of the 2Spirit narrative in history. Just taking a little time. Again, the erasure continues. And again, because people have grown up intergenerationally with the binary. It's their identity, it's their comfort zone, it's all they know, right? And you see it reflected in the National Day of Reconciliation. And I created this t-shirt because I felt that narrative was very heteronormative. And they were not acknowledging that there was 2Spirit people, children, in those schools for over 150 years. And so I created this t-shirt that says, every 2Spirit child matters, to remind people, you know, this is about truth and reconciliation. If we're going to talk about truth, we have to tell the true story and not write a story that makes us, you know, heterosexual people feel comfortable, right? And again, this is from the 2Spirit Dry Lab in Vancouver. They created a medicine bundle to educate 2Spirit people about sexual health. So that's merging of traditional medicine with Western technology around testing for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. So that's another academic process because it's about research, right? Health research. And as I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister, the federal government finally moved the 2S acronym to the front of the LGBTQI acronym. And that's after 33 years of that name being introduced by Dr. Laramie. And sometimes that's how long community development takes, right? But we never stopped. And so we continued our advocacy and activism. And so last year, they announced $100 million over 5 years for continuing capacity building for the queer community in Canada. And so in terms of identity, 2Spirit Sundance is happening here in August in Manitoba. And then the 2Spirit Powwow that I attended in San Francisco in February. And then some of our people who are contributors through education, through getting your, junior high, your high school diploma, graduation, and going into universities and getting 1 or 2 degrees and having a career, right? And that's the right of everybody, and that is the promise of the treaties and agreements, whether you are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, right? That is part of the deal, that you would get a good education. So we have Dr. Alex Wilson from Opaskwayak Cree Nation. She teaches at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Chantal Fiola at the University of Manitoba, very accomplished Métis activist and educator. And then Jordi Einstar is that new generation who grew up in that 33 years of 2Spirit, where he doesn't have to carry that burden, right, that my generation carried of historic trauma, right, or discrimination, so that they can flourish without that burden. And that's what it's really about. And Laurie McDonald, who is the first 2Spirit Indian residential school survivor to become a member of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Survivor Circle, right? And this is me getting my honorary doctorate in 2018. And when you're given that opportunity, it's always awkward. It's like, oh, this is so exposing one's identity, right? And again, but that's what you have to do. Like, you have to go into these institutions and be present and claim them, right? And so I was at the last convocation, I think in the fall. I watched 700 students graduate that day, in one day, with diplomas and with degrees, bachelor's and master's degrees, right? And so that that 2Spirit people are in these institutions, in these formal institutions at this level. Now, in terms of reconciliation, we have to be very careful of continuing to impose that colonial binary, because it can be construed as being conversion therapy, right? If you maintain, the language, male and female, and not recognizing non-binary or transgender, or people's pronouns or their names may have changed because they've transitioned, it can be construed that you're actually practicing conversion therapy, right? Which is illegal in Canada as of January last year, right? So some of the best practices: adapt to the 2Spirit reality of your child, continue the love and nurturing, support 2Spirit gatherings, support 2Spirit chosen surrogate families, create and support 2Spirit rites of passage. So I grew up in the 60s, so the Avon little lipsticks with my rite of passage, if anybody remembers those. Affirm 2Spirit personal gender identity, expression, and pronouns. Include 2Spirits in cultural, spiritual, and political events, and then provide 2Spirit specific sexual health information. In terms of best practices in education, include 2Spirit history and contemporary experiences in Indigenous education courses. Hire 2Spirit scholars and elders to work in educational institutions and Indigenous student services. Educate parents and families about 2Spirit history and identity. Provide support groups, services, and safe spaces for 2Spirit students and educators. Schools and universities should participate in annual Pride events. Provide bursaries and scholarships for 2Spirit students and scholars. Advocate for 2Spirit students and staff who are experiencing racism, homophobia, or transphobia. Provide historic trauma and harm reduction supports for students and staff. Celebrate and attend your 2Spirit